There's a note from the Cuban embassy in the U.S., note from Ministry of the Interior. On the morning of February 25th, 2026, a violating speedboat was detected within Cuban territorial waters. The vessel, registered in Florida, United States, with registration number FL7726SH, approached up to 1 nautical mile northeast of the El Pino Channel in Cayo Falcones, Corralillo Municipality, Villa Clara Province, when a surface unit of the border guard troops of the Ministry of the Interior carrying 5 service members approached the vessel for identification. The crew of the violating speedboat opened fire on the Cuban personnel, resulting in the injury of the commander of the Cuban vessel. As a consequence of the confrontation, as of the time of this report, 4 aggressors on the foreign vessel were killed and 6 were injured. The injured individuals were evacuated and received medical assistance. In the face of current challenges, Cuba reaffirms its determination to protect its territorial waters based on the principle that national defense is a fundamental pillar of the Cuban state in safeguarding its sovereignty and ensuring stability in the region. Investigations by competent authorities continue in order to fully clarify the events. So it could be a covert operation. More likely than not, it's probably a bunch of reactionary Gusano, Miami Cubans that like hired a private security team on their own to do a little Bay of Piglet 2.0, you know? We shall see how the American government responds to it, but I suspect that the American government's response will tell you who was actually responsible for this, because the reality of the matter is there are a lot of psychopaths. Okay, there are a lot of right-wing psychopaths who are salivating at the prospect of the instability in Cuba and want to make things worse. It's screaming CIA. I mean, they've done this in Venezuela as well. It could be because the CIA no longer has the same motion it once did. So it wouldn't be all that shocking to me if this was unironically like a covert initiative. It doesn't read government to me. I could see this being like a parallel incident where you know, a bunch of like far right. The CIA doesn't run a speedboat towards armed Cuban guards on the open seas. I mean, they kind of did do that in Venezuela, if you remember. That's why I'm saying like it could be, but probably not. I mean, this seems very amateurish, even though there was a similar situation in Venezuela. If you remember, they had a bunch of like security contractors that tried to like invade Venezuela a couple of years prior, and they got overtaken by fishermen. Yeah, I'm talking about Operation Gideon was an unsuccessful attempt by the active coalition of the Venezuelan International Reserve, Venezuelan Dissidents, a private security firm, Jordan Gurdo's Silver Corp USA, to infiltrate Venezuela by sea and remove Nicolas Maduro from power. The plan, executed from the 3rd and 4th of May 2020, was for expatriate Venezuelan former military personnel living in Colombia to enter the country by boat at Macuto, take control of an airfield, capture Maduro and other high-level figures in his administration, and expel him from the country. If you remember, they literally caught these guys, like fishermen were able to catch these guys. I'm not even joking. It wasn't even the Venezuelan Coast Guard, I'm pretty sure. There's also the DPRK incident, but that was U.S. Navy SEALs. Obviously, this was a declassified report. There was a botched mission where they just they just murdered a bunch of Korean fishermen because they encountered them by accident during a botched mission. So, you know, but that was the American government doing that, and they did actually kill all of the people that caught them, and then they off. So I don't know where this goes, but this is at least this is actually signaling that there might be a little bit of easing of restrictions, even though the restrictions were initially totally unnecessary. Hopefully that happens though. And what else is there to say, honestly, other than hopefully they ease the restrictions? Is completely unacceptable. The fact that they're strangling the island is not only totally unnecessary, but it's totally f***ed up. The Cuban government released a statement earlier today saying that troops killed 4 on a Florida speedboat. Border troops, Cuban Coast Guard, engaged in a gunfight near the island nation's coast. The Cuban Interior Ministry said 4 were killed and 6 others were injured. The injured were transported to a hospital in Cuba. The Cuban government said its border troops killed at least 4 people and wounded 6 others in a gunfight with the occupants of a Florida-based speedboat that had entered its territorial waters on Wednesday, 1 mile off the coastline of Cuba. The vessel approached within 1 nautical mile northeast of El Pino Channel, north of Corralillo, a town in the central Cuban province of Villa Clara, according to a statement from Cuba's Ministry of the Interior. 5 Cuban border guard troops on a government boat approached the speedboat seeking identification. When the people aboard the boat opened fire on the Cuban personnel, wounding a Cuban commander, according to the ministry's statement and Cuban state media, they opened fire back. As a result of the confrontation, at the time of this report, 4 foreign attackers were killed and 6 were wounded, the government said. The wounded were evacuated and received medical attention. The Cuban government said its statement included, what it said was the boat's Florida registration number. Vice President J.D. Vance told reporters that he had few details, but that Secretary of State Marco Rubio had briefed him on the shooting. It's a situation that we're monitoring, Mr. Vance said. Hopefully it's not as bad as we fear it could be, but I can't say more because I just don't know more. A U.S. official initially said the firefight had involved a U.S. civilian boat that was a part of a flotilla to get relatives out of Cuba, adding that the vessel was not a U.S. Naval or Coast Guard boat. But later, intelligence confirmed that a single boat had been attacked. The U.S. Coast Guard referred questions about the shooting to the U.S. Embassy in Havana, which has not responded to requests for comment. The boat is a Florida registered boat that appears to be a 24-foot pro-line motorboat built in 1981, according to Florida state records. This is what corresponds to the registration number provided by the Cuban authorities. Typically, such a 24-foot boat has a capacity for 8 to 10 people. Cuban officials suggested 10 were aboard the one attacked on Wednesday. Okay? If there were 10 people on a 24-foot boat, it's very unlikely that they're trying to go to Cuba to extract Cuban citizens and bring them back to the United States of America, which, by the way, is currently illegal, just so you know. Donald Trump actually released an executive order the other day, a couple weeks ago, saying that American vessels, American seafaring vessels are no longer allowed to take off from Miami ports and travel to Cuba. The reason why I'm paying close attention to this story is because we're literally putting together a humanitarian flotilla and a convoy by air, by sea, whichever way we can. So this is very different than anything else that we are planning on doing. But of course, don't let a crisis go to waste. Americans have been responding. In a statement, Representative Carlos A. Jimenez, Republican of Florida, who is a major reactionary, called for an immediate investigation into what he called a massacre. The Attorney General of Florida, James Othmeyer, said he had ordered the state's Office of Statewide Prosecution to open an investigation into the shooting, adding, "The Cuban government cannot be trusted, and we will do everything in our power to hold these communists accountable." Tensions with the U.S. are obviously increasing. Faced with widespread oil shortages and soaring food prices, the Cuban economy is in a freefall, and experts say it could become a watershed moment for the communist government. The Trump administration has stopped oil shipments to Cuba and has threatened tariffs on the goods of any other country that tries to deliver oil to Cuba. The Cuban government has denounced the U.S. measures. The shooting comes amid an aggressive campaign by the Trump administration against speedboats in the region that the White House has claimed are trafficking drugs to the United States. It has not provided evidence to support those claims. The U.S. military has conducted 44 known strikes, killing at least 150 people in attacks that legal experts say violate international law. The shooting took place a day after the 30th anniversary of when the Cuban military killed 4 people by shooting down 2 planes from a Florida humanitarian organization, Brothers to the Rescue, that was distributing flyers in Cuba. Those people are acting in that fashion, going there to Cuba to pick up people, are risking their lives, said Jose Basulto, the leader of the Brothers to the Rescue, who was on a 3rd plane that escaped Cuban gunfire. Yeah, it's insane, the audacity of Americans. Like, can you imagine if there was an unknown Cuban plane flying over the American airspace and that the American government shot it down, and then the Cubans were like, well, this is a humanitarian plane, how dare you shoot us down? Yeah, that's how it works. Like, what are you talking about? What do you mean? Oh, we were just distributing pamphlets. Okay, well then get the proper authorization. It's not like planes are not allowed to fly over Cuba or into Cuba at all. They fly over Cuba all the time. They fly into Cuba all the time, except they have the proper clearance to fly over Cuban airspace. How ridiculous. We talk as though America was simply trying to help out Cuba, and those violent radicals shot these random planes over their airspace. It's like, yeah, no it's because America is benevolent and Cuba is not. Yeah, exactly. Anyway, the Florida registered boat appears to be a 24-foot pro-line motorboat built in 1981. That's certainly not a ship, more like a fishing boat. Typically, a 24-foot boat like that has a capacity for 8 to 10 people, and the Cuban officials suggested 10 were aboard. This is what the boat looks like. Yeah, we shot a Hellfire missile on a weather balloon, and we're over here being like, I can't believe Cubans opened fire on a random plane, especially when random planes from the United States of America have literally crop dusted the entire Cuban agricultural output with non-indigenous invasive species specifically to destroy their crops. So yeah, of course they're going to protect their own sovereign airspace. Yeah, and the Bay of Pigs too. So let's see how the American government treats this incident. But the reality of the matter is the records on the Florida registered boat don't say much, including who owned it. Records purchased off a website for prospective boat owners say the boat was last purchased in December 2022 and is registered for commercial use. 8 years ago, it was registered for recreational use. Nation media coverage and reactions for lawmakers.
Confrontation in Cuban territorial waters between Cuban troops and people on an American registered speedboat. Here's what we know at this Our Cuba's Ministry of the Interior says a speedboat, they say, with a Florida registration opened fire on Cuban border guard troops this morning. The ministry says it happened when the troops approached the American boat to request identification and that the commander of the Cuban vessel was injured. The ministry says the troops then...
JD Vance, Rubio, and the White House not immediately getting aggro about this is an interesting optic. There's more to this than meets the eye, it seems. Yeah, that's why my initial reaction was this is probably not a covert operation from the CIA, but instead, like, most likely a bunch of random Miami Cubans that wanted to take matters into their own hands. Let's be real. Miami Cubans are some of the most reactionary Americans out there, okay? I'm sorry. No offense to your parents. You already know this better than me. If you're a Miami Cuban that's in this chat, you probably have already encountered many in your neighborhood. Do you really feel like they don't have the capacity to try and take matters into their own hands? I'm sure you've met people that would gladly do this, okay? Which is part of the reason why I think like it might not have been like security contractors or CIA or something like that. Isn't that the exact group the CIA employed to do covert ops though? Yes. In the past, yes. Kelly Meyer, White House correspondent for News Nation, says Secretary Rubio said a lot of the information is coming from the Cuban government and they want to verify it themselves. We're going to have our own information on this. It's highly unusual to see shootouts happen in the open sea like that, Rubio adds. We're not going to base our conclusions on what they told us. We'll respond appropriately based on what our information tells us. I think they're trying to see how they can maneuver around this on the messaging front to see if it actually suits their goals, to be like, oh, these are brave warriors, they got shot. They can try to be like, oh, these were martyrs who got shot and killed. They were just trying to save their like Cuban grandparents or some I don't know. This is why we have to do an even more rigorous blockade or something. I don't know.
It was on that boat, but it comes as, you know, there has been this huge military buildup on the other side of the Caribbean. And also the Trump administration has been really escalating its rhetoric towards the Cuban government. Secretary of State Rubio, of course, is Cuban American and has made a large part of his political career being very, wanting to topple essentially the Cuban government, the communist government there. But again, at this point, we do not have any details about who was on that boat.
We thank you. As we look at this map here, I'm going to bring in Jose Diaz-Balart. Guys, let's put that map back up. I want to show the viewers exactly where this is happening right now. Jose, talk our viewers through the location here, right? Because again, where you see that little white dot at the top of northwest Cuba, this is where the incident, according to the Cubans, happened, 1 nautical mile off those keys off the north of Cuba. So this is very close to the Bahamian border. Again, Sal Bank, which is an area people go to fish, but also people where they go to drop off sometimes Cubans that they're smuggling, Cuban refugees that are trying to leave the island. Jose, we can't stress enough, this is such a sort of strenuous time right now between the U.S. and Cuba has made it very clear.
Bro, why the would they have guns on? Like, what are you talking about? They have guns on board.
Carlos Jimenez, here's what he had to say this afternoon, writing in part, quote, I am calling for an immediate investigation into this massacre. United States authorities must determine whether any of the victims were U.S. citizens or legal residents and establish exactly what occurred. The regime in Cuba must be relegated to the dustbin of history for its countless crimes against humanity. And Florida Republican Senator Rick Scott also joined in the congressman's call for a U.S.-led investigation. We are also hearing from Democratic Congresswoman Debbie Wasserman Schultz. She shared this statement with us here in Washington today. Quote, I am deeply concerned by reports of a shooting involving Cuban regime forces and a Florida registered vessel, as well as the silence from the Trump administration on this deadly incident. My office has contacted the State Department for more information, but it's notable that this occurred in spite of ongoing Trump administration negotiations with the Cuban regime. It goes without saying we cannot trust the Cuban regime's side of the story without scrutiny. We need an immediate investigation into this shooting and accountability for the Cuban regime.
This is just like when the Israeli opposition will immediately comment on like the ICC saying Benjamin Netanyahu is a war criminal, right? When it comes to foreign policy, you really understand the duopoly. You really understand the bipartisan consensus. All of a sudden, everyone's like, oh, well, should we starve Cuba? Well, can you give us a justification for it? Or they don't even talk about it at all. But then the moment where like a bunch of psychotic fascists decide to like invade the island, take matters in their own hands and get shot at after they shoot at the Coast Guard, it's uniparty. Boom. Instantly, everyone's like, oh, yeah, this violent regime. This violent regime must be dealt with. We must nuke the island now.
regime's use of lethal force against Americans at sea. Now, as the congressman noted there, we have yet to hear from the White House and President Donald Trump himself about these developments in Cuba this afternoon. For months now, President Trump has been putting increased pressure on the Cuban regime, making multiple moves in just the last few months to further cut off a supply of international oil flowing to the island nation.
I don't know if the State Department actually like paid them to do this. That's what I'm trying to say. I don't know if the State Department paid them to do this or if they just like took matters in their own hands. Right now, it kind of feels like they just took matters in their own hands. If this was a more organized initiative in the hands of like the CIA or the State Department, Marco Rubio would have a much better and much faster response to it, where they'd be like, oh, these were brave humanitarian aid workers that Cuba ruthlessly slaughtered, and we're going to punish the island, you know, all that. Like if they knew that this was going to happen, it was an operation. I mean, they'll still take advantage of this, but if they knew that this was a operation, they would have had a media response ready to. You would have remember how after Camila Cabello came out with her statement being like, it's not the American government that's starving the Cubans, it's the Cuban government starving the Cubans, like that dumbass statement. And for like a week after that, all these Stan accounts were activated out of nowhere for a celebrity whose last poppin' song was in like 2014 or whatever. I personally think that was a deliberate response that didn't happen randomly. That was to justify the American government's initiatives by, you know, doing a bodies and spaces standpoint epistemology, a justification for the blockade. It failed, right? It didn't really work that well because it's Camila Cabello. It's not like they were able to deploy like a notable actress or celebrity or anything like that. And very shortly thereafter, it was AstroTurf. Like very shortly after that message, it was on Billboard. It was on a bunch of other outlets as well. And there was some Stan accounts that were just like, why are y'all talking over a Cuban woman, an immigrant, blah blah blah, all this. It flopped, but that was more organized. That was more organized than what you're hearing from the administration right now. I think if this was a legitimate operation that got thwarted by the Cuban Coast Guard, they were trying to do an actual destabilizing operation, maybe like target the energy grid, something like that. They probably would have more people on the boat rather than 10 people, right? They would do a bunch of different, they would try to do a bunch of different incursions and invasions. And then if one of them got killed, if one of the boats got intercepted in the process, they would have a readily available response about whatever the cover story is, right? Like, oh, these guys were on a humanitarian mission and the Cuban government attacked them because they hate humanitarian aid or something.